But as some of you know, intelligent design is a rather controversial subject. So whenever I start speaking on the topic, I always make sure to begin with a disclaimer that, in case you didn't know, I'm not speaking for my university. I'm not speaking for my biology department colleagues. My mother disagrees with me. This is just me talking. Okay, so the question to be debated is, should intelligent design be taught as a science? And I'm going to answer with a qualified yes. If any other theory that purports to explain the appearance of design in nature is taught as a science, then I think, yes, intelligent design should be too. And the arguments that I'll bring out tonight are essentially a summary of some arguments I made in a chapter in a book called Divine Action and Natural Selection. I had chapter 34. Professor Barr has a chapter in the same book, chapter 23. And I'm going to start off with some background. And I'm going to make the point that science is not coextensive with rationality. Science is a particular activity of investigating nature by means of systematic observation, measurement, and classification. That's kind of a dictionary definition. But there are other modes of reasoning that are more fundamental than science. An easy example is mathematics and logic. And more subtle examples are the perception of reality, the perception of an outside world, existence itself. And related to that, perception of other minds. Are you the only mind in the universe, or are there others? And I'm going to continue now with a couple of basic points, kind of laying some groundwork before I get to my argument. One point is that a fundamental facet of our rationality is our ability to discern the existence of other minds, and that's going to be crucial to my talk. In our world, we perceive other minds through their physical effects. A theory which arbitrarily rules out mind as an explanation for certain physical effects has abandoned a facet of reason. Abandoning a facet of reason leads ultimately to irrationality. So those are kind of some underlying premises. But here is my actual argument for the question up for debate tonight. My first point is this. Life reeks of design. It reeks of design. Another theory, Darwinism, purports to explain the appearance of design in nature. That is a very questionable assertion. Since Darwinism is taught as science, intelligent design should be so taught also. Failure to do so, failure to teach both, can lead to irrationality. But what is intelligent design? That's, of course, a basic question here. What is intelligent design? If you look in a dictionary, you'll see a number of definitions. The pertinent one is this: the purposeful or inventive arrangement of parts or details. And we can shorten that to design is simply the purposeful arrangement of parts. Notice that in this definition, you have both the physical, the parts, which is open to science, and the idea of a mind, purposeful, the purposeful arrangement of parts. In our world, we infer design. We conclude design has happened whenever parts appear to be arranged to accomplish a function. That is, we infer the mental by means of the physical. Okay, an example may help to drive this home. Let's look at the next slide. This is a Far Side cartoon, for those who haven't seen Far Side before. And we've got a troop of jungle explorers here. And the lead explorer has been strung up and skewered. And this fellow here turns to this guy here and says, "That's why I never walk in front." Words to live by, I can assure you. Now, everybody in this auditorium looks at this cartoon, and you immediately know that this was designed. This was no accident. His death was intended. As a matter of fact, the humor of the cartoon depends on you recognizing the design. But how do you know that? Is it a religious conclusion? Probably not. You know it's designed because you see a purposeful arrangement of parts. A purposeful arrangement of parts. You see the physical and you infer the mental behind it. Somebody put that up there. All right, with this as background, let me go to the various points of my formal argument. The first of which is this. Life reeks of design. Life reeks of design. But don't take my word for it. Take the word of Richard Dawkins, who is perhaps the most well-known Darwinist in our time. And in one of his books, he starts out on page 1 by proclaiming, "Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." So according to Dawkins, that's the very definition of biology, the study of things that appear to have been designed. Well, how do we know? He, of course, does not think they were designed. He's a Darwinist and thinks Darwinian processes are responsible. But why does he even think they look designed? You know, why he doesn't think they were designed? Why does he think they look designed? Is it for some aesthetic reason? Is it because, baby seals are so cute or rainbows are so pretty? No, for Dawkins, it's not an aesthetic judgment. It is an engineering judgment. He writes, "We may say that a living body or organ is well designed if it has attributes that an intelligent and knowledgeable engineer might have built into it in order to achieve some sensible purpose. Any engineer can recognize an object that has been designed just by looking at the structure of the object." What's he saying? He's saying the purposeful arrangement of parts is how we recognize design. Well, is the appearance of design in biology, is it like seeing faces in the clouds? Is it ephemeral or what? Not according to Dawkins. According to Dawkins, the appearance of design in biology is overpowering. He writes, "The living results of natural selection, which he thinks is responsible for the appearance, overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design, as if by a master watchmaker, impress us with the illusion of design and planning." Now, Dawkins was writing in 86, and he's primarily a zoologist concerned with animals. But as you know, science has made much progress in understanding the molecular and cellular basis of life, which is the foundation of life. And that knowledge has only increased the overwhelming appearance of design. For example, 10 years or so ago, the journal Cell published a special issue on molecular machines with articles that have titles such as "The Cell is a Collection of Protein Machines," "Polymerases in the Replosome," "Machines Within Machines," "Mechanical Devices of the Spliceosome," "Motors, Clocks, Springs, and Things." And here's an example of a molecular machine that is not listed in that table. This is called a cilium. And I'd just like to tell you that each one of these dots here, colored dots, is itself a very complex protein. And there are hundreds of proteins that make up this thing. But the interesting thing is this is a computer drawing of a cilium. Look where it's published. It's published in the journal Nanotechnology. Life contains nanotechnology, machines that are difficult even for humans to produce at this time. So that's my Okay. Oh, and another one. And this is continuing. This is a story. The next slide is a story from the current issue of the journal Nature, the most prominent science journal in the world. Life is complicated. The more biologists look, the more complexity there seems to be. This is published on the 10th anniversary of the decoding of the human genome. And it essentially says that scientists have found unexpected depths of complexity. Here's a few quotes from the paper. The complexity of biology has seemed to grow by orders of magnitude. The more we know, the more we realize there is to know. The signaling pathways were fairly simple and linear, we thought, in the past, but now it's infinitely more complex. So the appearance of design is really getting overpowering. Holy moly. Time flies. Darwinism, which is taught as a science, purports to explain design. So this is my second point. And as evidence, I will show a quote from Douglas Fatuma, who's president of the Society for the Study of Evolution. And he writes that the reason that natural selection is important is that it's the central idea that explains design in nature. And he goes on to say that it displaces God as an explanation for that design. So Darwinism purports to explain design. And that's a very questionable assertion. And for that, we will look at a man named Franklin Harold, who wrote a book called The Way of the Cell, published by Oxford University Press. And he was commenting on intelligent design. And he wrote the following: "We should reject, as a matter of principle, the substitution of intelligent design for the dialogue of chance and necessity. But we must concede that there are presently no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations." In other words, we're ruling out intelligent design not because of the data, but because of an arbitrary principle. Thus, intelligent design should be taught as a science. And here I'll quote myself from that chapter in the book. And I wrote, "In proposing explanations for nature, we must use all the data and all of the rational faculties we have. The end result of stubborn adherence to a simplistic division of nature into discoverable mechanics and undiscoverable purpose, I say, is nothing less than the official divorce of science from reason." And remember, one of the facets of reason is to be able to recognize other minds. Failure to do so leads to irrationality. I'm going to skip a couple of these because I'm running low on time. Oh, that was funny. And go directly to what I perceive as its effects in biology. Here's quotations from a standard review in Febb's Letters, which is a biology journal, on protein folding, the co-translational folding and interactions of nascent protein chains. And the author is just doing science. Another important constraint is the inability of a cell to tolerate significant amounts of unfolded, non-functional protein. As a result, every cell has evolved mechanisms that identify and eliminate misfolded and unassembled proteins. And he goes on to say, to accomplish a timely recognition of nascent membrane proteins by the translocon-bound RNC during the integration process, the system has therefore evolved a mechanism that utilizes ribosome-induced folding of selected nascent chain sequences within the ribosomal tunnel. Okay? All right. Well, of course, as you may have noticed, he's talking about a little bit about evolution. But if you remember the quotation from what's his name? The author of The Way of the Cell, Franklin Harold, thank you. We have no evidence that these systems evolved by Darwinian processes. Now let's do a little trick. Let's look at this, let's reread this sentence. As a result, every cell has mechanisms that identify and eliminate misfolded and unassembled proteins. What knowledge have we lost by taking away that word? Let's do it for the second sentence. To accomplish a timely recognition, this system has a mechanism that utilizes ribosome-induced folding. What knowledge have we lost? We have lost no knowledge. Therefore, these statements are non-rational, or I would even say irrational. We have no basis for making them. But if you are familiar with the biology literature, and if you're sensitive to it like I am, and very few other biologists are, you see this all the time. So here's a summary of my argument. Life looks exceedingly designed. The design of life is the subject of scientific study by Darwinism, but Darwinism is a shaky explanation, and since Darwinism is taught as a science, there is no reason that intelligent design should not be taught as a science. And failure to do so, to rule out one live possibility, can lead to irrationality. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for all coming out here tonight to hear Mike and me. Can you hear me? Am I speaking? Okay. The intelligent design movement argues that certain kinds of complexity found in the biological realm, particularly what they call irreducible complexity and specified complexity, can only be explained as the result of the intervention of an intelligent designer. I'm not here to argue against the intelligent design hypothesis. I regard it as a reasonable hypothesis. I am quite open to the possibility that it may even be the correct explanation of some complex biological structures, though I think it would be extremely difficult ever to prove this. My thesis is that the ID hypothesis, whatever its merits, is not a scientific hypothesis, and therefore should not be taught as such in science classrooms and textbooks. That is the title of this debate. Should intelligent design be taught as science? The word science has been used in different ways. It comes from the Latin word scientia, meaning simply knowledge. In some contexts, theology has been considered a science. In the Middle Ages, indeed, it was considered the highest science, the queen of the sciences. The subjects we usually call science today, geology and physics and chemistry, for example, have only been called that for about 200 years. Before that, they were called natural philosophy. So words have shifted their meaning over time, and the boundaries between disciplines have shifted as well. But for a long time now, people have ordinarily used the word science primarily to refer to disciplines like physics, chemistry, geology, astronomy, botany, zoology, and so forth. In other words, the so-called natural sciences, which study things that are below the human level, like electrons, quarks, atoms, molecules, planets and stars, bacteria, plants, and animals. There are also the social sciences, which study human behavior and human society, such as anthropology, economics, and political science. Today, I think we are talking about natural science. For a long time, it has been regarded as the task of the natural sciences to look for the natural explanations of natural phenomena. That is not because only natural explanations can be true, or because only natural explanations are worth looking for. It's just because that's what natural science is all about. Its business is to look for natural explanations. That is what scientists are trained to do, and that is what they're paid to do. If I pay for a science teacher, I expect him to tell me, or my children, how nature works, not his views on ultimate reality or what it all means. The reason that science textbooks and science classes should not talk about God or supernatural causes is very simple. It's because science textbooks and science classes should stick to their own business. I work in a particular branch of natural science called physics. Our business is to look for physical explanations of physical phenomena. I think that most of us here would agree that some things exist that are not just physical. You and I, for example. Our minds, our consciousness, our rationality, our free will are not just physical phenomena. There may be rational explanations of these things, but they are not physics explanations. In the same way, if you identify a phenomenon that does not have a natural explanation, it lies outside the purview of natural science. Both Mike and I believe in miracles, for example. Both he and I believe that Jesus turned water into wine. But neither of us thinks that this was a new effect in chemistry, or that it should be discussed in chemistry textbooks as the water-wine effect. Both Mike and I believe that Moses parted the Red Sea, but neither of us believes that this was a new effect in hydrodynamics. At this point, I know that some will want to point out to me that the ID movement makes no claim that the intelligent design of life on Earth happened by some miraculous or supernatural means. I understand that. But the logic of their position leads in the final analysis to the conclusion that the intelligent designer and his activities must lie beyond nature. Let me explain why I say this. What the ID theorists claim to be their scientific hypothesis is that some kind of intelligent designer crafted terrestrial life. They leave aside the question of who or what that designer was. Mike said in an article published in 2001, quote, "I strongly emphasize that intelligent design, is not an argument for the existence of a benevolent God, as Paley's was. I hasten to add that I myself do believe in a benevolent God, and I recognize that philosophy and theology may be able to extend the argument, but a scientific argument for design in biology does not reach that far. Thus, while I argue for design, the question of the identity of the designer is left open. Possible candidates for the role of designer include the God of Christianity, an angel, fallen or not, Plato's demiurge, some mystical New Age force, space aliens from Alpha Centauri, time travelers, or some utterly unknown intelligent force," unquote. I note in passing that Mike himself, in the passage I just quoted, draws a distinction between scientific arguments, which only can go so far, and the philosophical and theological arguments that may be based on them and extend them. But that's not why I quoted that passage. I'm more interested at the moment in his list of possible intelligent designers. Two of the candidates in that list, time travelers and space aliens from Alpha Centauri, could be considered natural explanations. Presumably, these space aliens or time travelers are biological organisms, as we are. And if so, they surely must be very complex, as we are. Their bodies would surely exhibit many of the kinds of structures that the ID theorists have identified as irreducibly complex or specifiedly complex. That being so, the logic of the ID position would necessarily entail that these space aliens or time travelers must themselves have been intelligently designed. By whom? By a different race of space aliens? By time travelers from a yet more distant future? Obviously, one cannot have space aliens being designed by other space aliens, being designed by other space aliens ad infinitum. Nor can one have an infinite regress of time travelers. The same problem of an infinite regress would inevitably arise if intelligent designers were only allowed to be physical entities dwelling within this universe and operating by natural means. To avoid an infinite regress, one has to resort somewhere along the line to a being who is supernatural. And that includes all the other reasonably well-defined candidates in Mike's list: the God of Christianity, an angel fallen or not, and Plato's demiurge. None of these things is the kind of natural explanation that natural science concerns itself with. There's one thing in the list that I don't know what to make of, namely mystical New Age force. I don't know what a mystical New Age force is, but it sounds supernatural to me. So it seems clear that the intelligent design hypothesis, even if it studiously refrains from specifying the identity of the intelligent designer, is implicitly positing an explanation that is beyond nature, and therefore that steps outside the boundaries of natural science, as those have traditionally been drawn, and into the realm of philosophy and theology. Now, I have no objection to stepping beyond the narrow confines of science. I have no objection to using discoveries made by science about the natural world to make philosophical and theological arguments, indeed arguments for the God of the Bible. I have made such arguments myself in my book, in articles, in interviews, and public lectures. One chapter of my book is, in fact, about the design of the universe. But my book was not intended as a textbook for a science course. I'm happy to say that it has been used in philosophy and theology courses as a textbook. And I think it would be entirely proper to teach the ideas of the intelligent design movement in philosophy classes in any school, public or private. What then should be taught in biology classes, according to me, about the kinds of structures that Mike has argued to be irreducibly complex, such as the bacterial flagellum and so on? The answer, it seems to me, is very simple, and maybe it's an answer Mike would agree with. If there are structures, such as the bacterial flagellum or the blood clotting system, for which science does not have a satisfactory explanation, it would be entirely proper for a science textbook or a science teacher to say exactly that. They could say, for example, there is much yet to discover about the history of life on Earth, and much that is not fully understood about this history. There does not yet exist a detailed step-by-step account of the processes by which certain complex structures evolved, or a full understanding of these processes. Period. As my favorite news source, Fox News Channel, says, we report, you decide. Let science say, honestly and forthrightly, what it knows and what it doesn't know. Then let everyone draw whatever philosophical or theological or anti-theological conclusions he wants, but after science class is over. Now, one might ask, why is it important to draw lines? Why is it important to draw lines between science, philosophy, and theology? Why divide up truth like that into truths of one type and truths of another? Truth is truth. First of all, I'm not trying to draw lines. The lines already exist and have for a long time. I am arguing for keeping the lines. I want the lines there, not to keep religion in its place, but to keep science in its place. I don't want scientists standing up in the classroom telling us what it all means or may mean. It's not their job. And frankly, I don't think they're up to the job. There are lots of things it takes to be a good scientist or a good science teacher. Certain kinds of knowledge and technical skill. But philosophical depth and wisdom are not among the job requirements. I have lived and worked among scientists for 40 years and have many friends who are scientists. But they're the last people I would want teaching my children about the deepest questions of existence. The lines protect us, religious believers. They may stop the lines between philosophy and science. They may stop teachers from teaching the so-called design hypothesis, it might be he and his colleagues. But more importantly, if properly enforced, they stop teachers from teaching atheism in the science classroom. One of the top people in my field of physics is Steven Weinberg. He's a Nobel Prize winner and sadly also a militant atheist. In one of his popular books, he made the following now famous statement. His book was written many years ago. Quote, "It is almost irresistible for humans to believe that we have some special relation to the universe, that human life is not just a farcical outcome of a chain of accidents, but that we were somehow built in from the beginning. It's very hard for us to realize that the entire Earth is just a tiny part of an overwhelmingly hostile universe. The more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless, unquote. A classic statement of scientific atheism. Weinberg believes that one of the philosophical lessons that can be drawn from modern science is that the universe is pointless and that there is no God who cares about us. But note the following important point. This statement of his was not made in a textbook. It was made in a popular book. Weinberg has written several great textbooks on particle physics and cosmology. I have used one of them in graduate courses I have taught on general relativity. Weinberg's textbooks stick to business. They do not contain atheist declarations. I'll tell you about my own experience in physics. I took courses in physics for 4 years in college and 4 years in graduate school. Since then, I have attended thousands of research talks, both at scientific conferences and at the universities and laboratories where I have worked. In all that time, I cannot remember a single atheistic statement being made in any physics classroom lecture, research talk, research paper, or textbook. Most physicists, whether believers or atheists, would think such statements out of place. If one of my colleagues on the physics faculty were to start making atheist arguments in physics class, I could complain to the chairman of my department and to my colleagues, and in so doing, I would have a principle to which I could appeal, that one's philosophical views do not belong in the science classroom. I know that the situation is not quite as good in biology. One can find statements of atheism in some biology textbooks, especially in sections devoted to explaining evolution. How much time do I have? I have one more page. Okay. Some years ago, I was looking for examples of this for a talk I was preparing, and an acquaintance of mine, who is a well-known figure in the ID movement, helpfully provided me with some examples. Here's one of several that I used in my talk. It is taken from a textbook published in 1994 called Biology, Concepts and Applications by C. Starr. Quote, every so often scientists stir up controversy when they explain part of the world that was considered beyond natural explanation, that is, belonging to the supernatural. This is sometimes true when moral codes are interwoven with religious narratives. Society has its standards. Those standards may be called into question when a new natural explanation runs counter to supernatural belief, unquote. This passage is not teaching biological concepts and applications. It is wandering off into very amateurish attempts at philosophy, the history of ideas, and the psychology of religion. It's not science and does not belong in a science textbook. Besides which, as history, it is total nonsense. But let me pose a question. Suppose we do start teaching in biology classrooms that various systems, the bacterial flagellum, the blood clotting system, and so on, are unlikely to have arisen by ordinary natural processes, but may have required some kind of designer who, despite disclaimers, everyone will understand to be God, or at least some supernatural agent. And then suppose that down the road, natural explanations are found for the origin of many or most of those systems. Wouldn't the deplorable statement that I just quoted from the biology textbook then be vindicated, at least in part? Wouldn't it be true at that point that scientists had, quote, explained part of the world that was considered beyond natural explanation, unquote? And that being the case, how could one object to inserting such a statement in a biology textbook, if only to explain why the new edition of the textbook differed from the old one, where certain biological structures were argued to be beyond natural explanation? You see, what starts out seeming like a very clever way to bring theistic ideas into the classroom, into the science classroom, however indirectly and by implication, can very easily end up, I dare say will end up, being the way that explicit atheism in science classroom, the teaching of explicit atheism in the science classroom is justified. We will have given them the authorization. In the long run, the line between science and philosophy protects us. Thanks.
All right, Dr. Behe, 10 minutes for a response.
Thank you. I very much enjoyed Steve's talk, and there's a lot with which I can agree, but I won't talk about that. Let me first take a few points. Before we came here, both Steve and I said, what are you going to talk about in the 10 minutes when you're doing a rebuttal? I don't know, but now I think we have something to say. Steve says that science should be confined to natural explanations. And he gave us a little history of science too, but he didn't mention that the idea of natural explanations has changed over time. As a matter of fact, one big example is Isaac Newton's theory of gravity. Back in the day, when Isaac Newton was talking about gravity, it struck many natural philosophers, or scientists as we'd call them today, as a supernatural explanation, because science said the only way two particles or two bodies could interact at that time is smacking against each other. And yet here was Newton saying the Earth and the Moon attract each other or exert some spooky force on each other without even touching each other. And that seemed to harken back to Aristotelian notions. But after a while, that came to be accepted as science. Another example, more closer to our own time, is the Big Bang Theory. When the Big Bang Theory was first proposed, it struck many scientists as a supernatural theory. What could the Big Bang be but the creation, the beginning? And what could make a universe except something beyond a universe? And as a matter of fact, a famous German chemist by the name of Walter Nernst proclaimed that the Big Bang Theory is not science. Science, by definition, requires the universe to be eternal. Requires it to be eternal. So any theory that proposes the universe is not eternal cannot be science. And I see a lot of parallels between a pronouncement like that and pronouncements these days that say that intelligent design is not science. Steve also said that why divide truth? And the truth, and he answered that it's to keep science in its place and protect religion. Otherwise, science would step into religion's place and try to explain that we live in a purposeless world or some such thing. Well, I don't know how much Steve gets out. But science already does this all the time. And a good example is from 5 years ago when that trial, the Kitzmiller trial, was in full gear. And there was a man named Cardinal Schönborn, a cardinal of the Catholic Church, wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times saying that evolution in the sense of common ancestry might be true, but evolution in the neo-Darwinian sense, an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection, is not. Any system of thought that denies or seeks to explain away the overwhelming evidence for design in biology is ideology, not science. Now, Steve took issue with that. He did not agree with the cardinal. He essentially said that that scientists use a more neutral term, random, which does not have the kind of theological overtones of unguided and unplanned. And he wrote about this in several articles in First Things. But I disagree with Steve. I think that when scientists teach Darwinian evolution, they mean a non-guided, non-designed. It has theological and philosophical overtones. And if you look, it's not hard to see that that's what most scientists, with the exception of maybe one or two in Delaware, understand Darwinian evolution to mean? For example, in 1995, the National Association of Biology Teachers, the association that represents the teachers who teach your kids biology, defined evolution. They said the diversity of life on Earth is the outcome of evolution, an unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural process of temporal descent. And who do you think they were trying to exclude with the idea of unsupervised and impersonal? These are, so essentially, the nation's largest biology teaching association takes it as a definition that Darwinian evolution, which is taught as a science, has these philosophical overtones. And remember, in my talk, I said that I understand intelligent design has philosophical overtones, scientific ones too, and I said that if another theory is taught which claims to explain the appearance of design, then we should teach intelligent design as science too. There are other problems. Here's one from a textbook by a man named Kenneth Miller and Joseph Levine. Of course, there has never been any kind of plan to evolution because evolution works without either plan or purpose. It is important to keep this concept in mind, and the next sentence is in bold. Evolution is random and undirected. And notice that they equate random and undirected. They use it in the same sense. Random does not mean something special to them. In September of 2005, 2 months after Cardinal Schönborn wrote his op-ed piece in the New York Times and called Evolution an Unguided, Unplanned Process, there was a controversy in Kansas about teaching evolution in the schools, a dust-up. And an open letter to the Kansas State Board of Education was sent by and signed by 39 Nobel laureates. And in it, they defined evolution. And they said evolution is understood to be the result of an unguided, unplanned process of random variation and natural selection. They used the exact words that Cardinal Schönborn did. And it was signed by Richard Axel, who won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2004. Linda Buck, also Medicine 2004. Gunnar Blobel, Medicine 1999. Aaron Chechenover, Chemistry 2004. Robert Curl, Chemistry 1996. David Gross, Physics 2004. Leland Hartwell, Medicine 2001. And about 30 other Nobel laureates. Now, if the leaders of science, as represented by these Nobel laureates, as well as represented by science teachers associations, mean by Darwinian evolution that it is an unguided and unplanned process, then that's what Darwinian evolution means. We are not free to make up our own definitions for terms and use them in our own special way. That only causes confusion. And if they're defining Darwinian evolution as an unguided process, then they have already exceeded the proper bounds of science. Now, in my own view, I think this is really not unexpected. As science probes deeper and deeper and deeper into reality, into fundamental questions like, how did life start? How did all this wondrous animal life and plant life come to be? Where did the universe come from? It is inevitable that people will see philosophical implications from the results. And it's also true that the scientific answers could have philosophical implications. So it's only natural to address the two together. So I have 1 minute, so let me see if I can get another good point in here. And let me just remind you what ID is. ID is not something, remember that jungle trap that I showed you? ID is not theology. I don't even know if you'd call it philosophy. You don't have to close your eyes and raise your hands to understand that something is designed. Design is something we apprehend. The apprehension of the work of other minds is one of our rational faculties, just like mathematics is, just like other things is. And because it's more fundamental than science, science cannot ignore that. We deduce design from physical data and from our ability to apprehend other minds. And now that we've gotten this far in science, I think intelligent design is an appropriate conclusion.
Dr. Barr, 10 minutes.
Okay. Even before Newton, Kepler, the great scientist Kepler, had said that he thought the tides were caused by an attraction of the moon across empty space. And Galileo said that was superstitious to believe that the moon could be pulling on the oceans. Of course, it turned out in Newtonian physics that's exactly what's going on. So you're right. It's not the idea of what's natural has evolved somewhat. But I think we better be careful. Though it's evolved, I don't think we ever want to get to the state. I don't think any Orthodox Christian could ever accept the idea that God is a part of nature, that God is a natural force. Okay? An Orthodox Christian says that there's an infinite difference between the Creator and the created world. God is not a part of nature. And I don't care how the idea of natural explanation evolves, it better not evolve to say that God is a natural force. It hasn't evolved all that much. In fact, there's a quote. Two of the greatest scientists of the Middle Ages. So this we're talking about the 13th. Jean Buridan, one of the greatest scientists of the 14th century, contrasted the philosopher's search for what he called, quote, appropriate natural. Philosopher meant scientist in those days. Remember, the scientist's search for what he called, quote, appropriate natural causes, with the common folk's habit of attributing unusual astronomical phenomena to the supernatural. In the 14th century, the natural philosopher, i.e. scientist, Nicole Orem, admonished that, and this, by the way, both of these were clergymen, both of these men were clergymen, admonished that in discussing the marvels of nature, quote, there is no reason to take recourse to the heavens, the last refuge of the weak, or demons, or to our glorious God, as if he would produce these effects directly, more so than those effects whose causes we believe are well known to us. Both of these great medieval scientists were saying that we should not always jump to God as an explanation. We should look for appropriate natural causes. That's what you do with science. They, of course, believed in God, and that God as the creator of the universe, and that God did intervene in the world on occasion. Now, what you said at one point towards the end of your remarks was that the biologists, the teachers, the Nobel Prize winners, and so on, and this is a direct quote, I wrote it down as you said it, have already exceeded the proper bounds of science. Aha! You just conceded my point. No, that there are proper bounds to science, and these philosophical conclusions that some people draw from science, whether atheist or theist, are beyond the proper bounds of science. Now, what you're saying is they've already done it. In other words, that I'm trying to close the barn door after the horse has already been stolen. Okay? And I understand that. As I said in my original statement, yes, I understand that things have gotten pretty bad in the world of biology, that biologists routinely make philosophically loaded statements. The answer to that is that we should unload them. We should try to get those kinds of statements out of the biology textbooks. I don't think it's an argument to say, well, scientists are doing this thing already. It may be bad, but they're doing it already, so let's do it ourselves, There are laws against theft. Those laws, they're property laws. They protect all of us. They protect our property. Now, those laws aren't always obeyed. There are people, especially in Wilmington, Delaware, one of the highest crime rates in the United States. People routinely violate the laws against theft. Does that mean because people have stolen something from me that I should go and get a little of my own back and steal something from someone else to make it even? No. The answer, if people are violating a law, is not to go out and violate it back. It's to get the law enforced better. Okay? And I think that the answer to the problem in biology is to try to convince the biologists. It may be difficult, but I think it's necessary to go over carefully the wording of these statements in textbooks. These gratuitous statements about unguided and unplanned are not necessary. As you yourself pointed out, you lose nothing of the science by deleting certain of these words. Okay? You could make a lot of the statements that are in those textbooks by Kenneth Miller and others, just cut out the unguided and unplanned, and the book would be just as have lost nothing scientific. That should be the campaign. Get the atheism, or at least the phrases that are redolent of atheism, suggest atheism, get them out of the books. And I would support that. Do I have any time?
You have 3 minutes.
Okay, let's see. Let's take it. I agree. I totally agree with you that we are able to infer design. Obviously, the human mind can see design. Let me take an example. Stonehenge. You could imagine that at some point in the past, people thought of Stonehenge as some geological phenomenon, some rock formation, and you could imagine geology textbooks giving various naturalistic theories of how Stonehenge formed. Maybe glaciers dragged giant boulders down, And no, maybe they thought it was a natural geological formation. Suppose somebody came along and pointed out the evidence that these were designed, as in fact we know they are. They say, look, this is a post and lintel construction. We've seen that before. Human beings build things with a post and lintel construction. And they could give all sorts of evidence that this is actually intelligently designed by somebody. What would happen? At that point, I think Stonehenge would disappear from the geology textbooks, because at that point people would know this isn't a geological, this is not a natural phenomenon. We've just found out it was intelligently designed by someone. It's not a natural phenomenon. It doesn't belong in a geology textbook. Geology studies the natural processes that lead to various natural phenomena, geological phenomena. It would disappear from the books, rightly. So I don't deny that you can spot design. I think what happens when you discover that something is not part of simply a natural process, it no longer belongs in a chemistry textbook, a biology textbook, a physics textbook. I guess that's it. Yeah.
Okay. I agree again with much of what Steve says, but I disagree on what I think are important things too. Just a second. I had a really great thought. And, oh yes.
Dean, your time's up.
Oh no. Okay. Steve says that, by gum, what we should do is get these scientists, get these teachers to toe the line, recognize the difference between science and philosophy. But I think that they will not agree that it's philosophy to say that these processes are unguided and unplanned. As a matter of fact, and there's an interesting ending to that story about the National Association of Biology Teachers statement, where they issued their statement that life is unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, a natural process of temporal descent. And there was a stink, because a couple of philosophers, including Alvin Plantinga and somebody else, wrote to them and says, hey, what are you talking about unsupervised as a biologist and impersonal? So we request that you take that out of your statement. And the biology teachers didn't want to. But then came in a lady named Eugenie Scott, who is the head of something called the National Center for Science Education, and tries to keep the best face on Darwinism for the public. And she said to the biology teachers, delete it. Those words, unsupervised, impersonal, they're implicit in the word natural. So if science is restricted to natural explanations, that means that life appeared by unsupervised, impersonal processes. Okay, I have a couple more minutes, and let me just read to you from this great article I really that I wrote for. I urge you, buy the book. Steve gets a cut too. And this kind of sums up my argument. Centuries ago, nascent modern science took a crucial step, breaking at last with old Aristotelian thinking. It would no longer consider nebulous final causes in its explanations. Whether the ultimate purpose of, say, a mountain was to display the grandeur of God or something else could not be decided by an investigation of nature. Henceforth, such questions would be relegated to philosophy or theology. Science would deliberately confine itself to issues about the mechanics of nature and ignore issues of purpose. What a horse or river or star is for would trouble science no longer. At the time, it seemed like a prudent course of action. Yet, the simplistic division of labor was doomed from the start, because some parts of nature quite clearly are for identifiable things. Science wished to explain the mechanics of nature apart from purpose, but especially in biology, the mechanics themselves often cannot be understood apart from purpose. The function of a mountain may not be decidable, but the function of a wing surely is. The purpose of a horse might be obscure, but the purpose of a horse's eye is not. Although over the years many scientists acting as individuals concluded that purpose was real, official biology self-consciously restricted itself to considering only non-purposive explanations for the origin of the apparently purposeful systems of life. I argue that this state of affairs is no longer tenable. Although for convenience, humans may carve up intellectual pursuits into various academic disciplines, reality is not obliged to respect such boundaries. In order to come to grips with the real world, in order to arrive at true explanations, rationality demands that we abjure artificial distinctions when their usefulness appears to have reached its limit.
Oh, okay. Let me just ask a question because I don't know the answer. After Eugenie Scott suggested they delete those words, did they delete them?
Yes.
They did. Okay, good. That's very good. Now, I don't care why they deleted them, but why? She said the reason you should delete them is because the atheistic or the atheistic conclusions are implicit already in the word natural, right? That the unguided, unplanned are implicit. Now, implicit means implied by, not stated but implied. Now, yes, Eugenie Scott and to many atheist biology teachers, the facts of biology, the facts of nature imply that there's no God. To Stephen Weinberg, the fact that the universe is, at least 10 billion light years across and we're a little tiny speck of dust lost in the vastness of space implies that the universe God doesn't care about us and that we don't amount to much. They're entitled to their philosophical spin. That they see those as the philosophical implications of certain scientific facts. Mike and I and many other scientists see other implications. We actually see theistic implications in many scientific facts. That's fine. But they should be left in the science textbooks. Only the scientific facts should be stated. The science should be stated. The implications, what one person or another thinks is implied, should be drawn somewhere else, not in the science classroom. Okay? And apparently, due to her efforts, that's happening. That is, they didn't state the implication in the textbook. They left the implication to be drawn somewhere else. That's what I think should be done. Now,
can I ask a little question?
Yeah. By the way, before you do, there have been other statements. Now, you probably know this better than I because you keep up with this kind of thing. But there was a statement I think came out about 5 years ago by the National Academy of Sciences, and I've seen it on their website, saying, evolution does not necessarily have atheist implications. There are many religious scientists, religious biologists, for whom the facts of evolution strengthen their faith and their belief in the beauty of nature, blah, blah, blah. So actually, I think there is some movement among scientists. There are people, I talked to Eugenie Scott because she came to Delaware, and I went up to her and I started saying something to her about Dawkins, and she rolled her eyes. And basically, what she thinks, though I think she's an atheist, is that people like Dawkins are doing a lot of damage by trying to hijack science and make everybody think that science is necessarily atheistic. She thinks that's harmful to science. Maybe just for the crass reason that people aren't going to pay money, tax money, to support science if they think it's an atheistic enterprise. But for whatever reason, she thinks that hurts science. And I think a lot of scientists are coming to the conclusion that it's bad to try for science to be too closely identified explicitly with atheism. And I think that's the reason why you found that statement, one finds that statement by the National Academy of Sciences. So there are reasons to believe that maybe some scientists, for whatever reason, might be willing to tone down some of this atheist rhetoric in textbooks. Anyway, ask me your question. Though it's not on my time.
Okay, whatever. You said... I'm a little bit confused. You say that these people thought that natural implies, Eugenie Scott said natural implies unguided and unplanned. And you were happy that they got...
She thinks
it does.
Yeah.
But don't you too? Because you said that science only employs natural explanations. And if I said that, here's an explanation which says it's guided and planned, you would say guided and planned is not science.
Read my article where I criticize Cardinal Schönborn more carefully. The sun forms by natural processes, okay? Clouds of gas and dust condense under the influence of gravity, and so on and so forth. We have a very good, well-established theory of how stars and the sun form by natural processes. Does that mean that that's not planned? No, because as any Orthodox Christian must, I believe that God knows, foreknew, and forewilled everything that happened from all eternity. Everything that happens is part of God's plan. God knew from all eternity that He created a universe in which certain natural processes would take place leading to the formation of the sun, and that was all part of His plan. There's no contradiction there.
Well,
By the way,
I think there is.
The two medieval scientists, who are also theologians, also believed in providence and God's foreknowledge and that everything was part of His plan.
Well, if I'm just focusing on the word natural and who owns it, and you seem to want to have it both ways, saying that natural science is restricted to natural explanation, but natural does not exclude guidance and planning.
This is the distinction drawn. Both, by the way, you might not know this. Both of us are Catholics. The traditional distinction.
We were trying to keep that hush hush.
So I wanted to say that because I'm about to invoke a very traditional, goes back to the Middle Ages, a very traditional distinction between primary and secondary causality. God accomplishes some things directly. When Christ turned water into wine, that was direct application of divine power. That wasn't through some natural chemical process. But other things God accomplishes through natural process. That is, through natural powers that he implants in things. Fire has the power to burn wood. That's part of the nature of fire and the nature of wood. God gave those things those natures, and fire burning wood is a perfectly natural process. God does everything. Okay? He is the creator of all things. Some things he does through secondary causality. He accomplishes his purposes through natural processes, and other things he accomplishes directly without making use of natural processes. This is
interrupt. I want to give Dr. Barr the opportunity to return the favor and ask you a question if he has one that's on his mind. Otherwise, I would like to open it up to the floor. So if you might start queuing up at the microphones, we want to start entertaining your questions as well. But Dr. Barr, if you have a question.
I don't have a question, so we can. I would like to end up with maybe one statement, and I think I may be wrong about this, but I have a suspicion, and maybe this is a question. I think a lot of people are too much in awe of science. In my view, philosophy is higher than science, and theology is higher than philosophy. The medievals had it right. But nowadays, people look down on theology and philosophy, and they look up to science. And so everything has to be scientific, whether it's selling shampoo, a new scientific formula for, listen to the commercials. Everything is scientific. So I think the ID movement's been sucked into this trap. In order to make, I think they're very interesting arguments for the existence of God more credible to people today, they want to have them called science. And they think there's something second-rate or something inferior about saying that these are philosophical arguments. I don't think so. I think philosophical arguments are perfectly respectable arguments, and I don't see why we have to call them science. Is that why you do it?
And then we'll open up the floor.
Yeah. I would like to say that you're under a misimpression, and perhaps you have been for a while, about my work. And that is, I'm not trying to make an argument for the existence of God. I believe in God. I've believed in God my whole life. I'm a biochemist. And those systems that I put up on the screen are systems that are studied by biochemistry. You learn about those things. You study them yourselves. And I'm asking myself, what's the best explanation for how those things got there? And when somebody tells me, no, you have to close your eyes and pretend that amazing functionality, that amazing elegance and so on, at the very lowest or very foundation level of life, that came here by some unguided, unplanned process, or by a Darwinian process. I rebel. I want to know the truth. That's why I got into science. And if somebody says something's off limits for me, and I see evidence pointing to that as the correct answer, I don't care. I continue in the same direction. So for me, the point is, what's the explanation for these things? How'd they get there? This is a physical system, this flagellum, this blood clotting system, these genetic networks and so on. How did they get there? And the current answer, there is no current adequate answer. And as I tried to show with the jungle trap, design is obvious. You can tell directly design by the purposeful arrangement of parts. And so I am not going to overlook an obvious example because somebody thinks it's violating some artificial boundary.
The colloquy would continue to be satisfying. All right, one comment.
By the way, I have no objection to that kind of argument for design. As I said, in my book, I have an entire part of my book in which I talk about the amazing intricacy, the deep mathematical structure of the laws of physics. And I basically argue that that bespeaks design, that must be the product of an intelligence, of a mind, of God. So there's nothing wrong with that kind of argument, and I do not at all forbid you from seeking truth and for making those arguments. But just as I don't think my argument from the beauty and the intricacy and the mathematical depth of the laws of physics to the existence of a mind that created them, I don't think that's not a part of physics. That is a philosophical conclusion that I draw from the physics fact. So I do no way want to forbid you from pursuing truth. I want to say that's a philosophical argument, not a biological argument.
Thank you, Dr. Behe. Dr. Barr, we're going to start over here to the right.